Ethan Carter never thought his gift for languages and songs would bring him to a faraway kingdom among the stars. He had grown up in quiet towns, never dreaming that his voice would be chosen to carry the hope of two worlds. Yet here he was, standing in the great docking bay of a kingdom ship that looked more like a palace than anything he had seen on Earth. Banners flowed in the artificial breeze, guards in polished armors stood in perfect lines, and beyond them stretched the shining towers of a city he could hardly believe was real. He carried no weapons, no authority, no grand titles. He was not a soldier or a leader. He was only a man who studied words and music. The other envoys from Earth wore suits of power, spoke with commanding tones, and carried themselves like people who expected obedience. Ethan felt small beside them, but he held to the thought that maybe his smallness had a purpose. The city seemed carved from light and stone. Tall spires reached into the sky, their surfaces glowing softly as if the very walls remembered the sun of another age. People in robes of deep colors filled the streets, curious to see the visitors from Earth. They did not smile. Their eyes were guarded, full of questions that no speech or contract could answer. In the heart of the palace waited Princess Alina. Ethan had heard her name spoken with respect and with fear. She was said to be unshakable, a woman who carried the burden of her people without letting the world see her weakness. She ruled beside a council of old voices, but the strength of the kingdom seemed to rest in her alone. When Ethan first saw her, she stood at the top of a staircase that looked as though it had been carved from crystal. Her gown moved like water around her, and her eyes were as steady as stone. She greeted the envoys with a bow of her head, nothing more. No smile touched her lips, no warmth softened her gaze. The Earth's envoys spoke in long sentences about trade and alliances. They promised technology, protection, and partnership. They used words heavy with power, words meant to impress. Ethan stood at the edge, silent, watching. He could see that their speeches did not reach her heart. She listened, but her face gave nothing back. Her hands rested calmly at her sides, but her eyes seemed to be somewhere far away. Each night, Ethan stayed in a small guest room of the palace, alone with his thoughts. He carried with him an old book of notes, filled with fragments of the kingdom's ancient tongue, pieces he had studied for years. He whispered them to himself like prayers, unsure if he would ever use them. To him they were music more than words, soft rhythms that felt alive when he sang them under his breath. On the third day, a royal gathering was called. The great hall filled with lords, soldiers, and counselors. The air was heavy with mistrust. The Earth envoy spoke again, but the words seemed to fall into a well that had no bottom. Ethan watched the princess. Her hands tightened on the railing of her throne, her eyes dark with thought. He knew in that moment that speeches would never heal the distance between them. He thought of the fragments in his book, the lullabies he had pieced together, the phrases that once carried comfort across a mother's lips to her child. His heart pounded. He had no right, no permission. Yet something inside him told him this was why he had come, not for trade, not for politics, but for a song. When the hall fell quiet for a breath, Ethan stepped forward. The other envoys glared at him, but he did not stop. He opened his mouth and let the old words rise from his chest. The sound was low at first, trembling, but then it grew steady. The hall filled with a melody none of them had heard in years, yet it carried the weight of memory. The language was broken in places, but the feeling was whole. The princess did not move at first. Her eyes widened, just slightly. Then, as the words flowed, her lips parted and her breath caught. She leaned forward, her gaze locked on him. No one else spoke. The hall seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Ethan sang on, his heart in every word, though he knew only fragments. And in that moment, he was no longer just a visitor. He was a bridge. A man carrying a voice that time had almost buried, now alive again in the presence of a princess who had waited all her life without knowing it. The song faded into silence, leaving the great hall still and heavy with wonder. Ethan lowered his voice and let the last note fall away, afraid to even breathe. The envoys from Earth shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between him and the throne. None of them had expected him to act, and none of them could undo what he had already done. Princess Alina sat frozen. Her fingers gripped the carved arms of her throne. The sound of the song still seemed to echo in her chest, pulling memories she had tried to bury. When she was a child, Her nurse had sung pieces of the old tongue to her in secret. But those words had almost vanished from her life. Hearing them again was like opening a locked door and finding her childhood waiting behind it. Her eyes shone, but she blinked the tears away, unwilling to show weakness. Murmurs ran through the hall. Lords whispered to one another, wondering how a man from Earth had learned words that even they barely remembered. Soldiers shifted in their armor, uneasy at the change in the air. The counselors frowned, uncertain if this display was a trick. Ethan stood with his head lowered, knowing he had risked everything. He was neither noble nor soldier, only a man with a voice, yet his song had reached further than any speech had managed. One of the Earth envoys stepped forward in anger. He called Ethan reckless, said that music had no place in matters of state. His voice carried pride and authority, but it did not carry the hush of memory that Ethan's song had left behind. The people in the hall barely listened to him. Their ears still remembered the music. Their hearts still beat with the rhythm of words they had thought forgotten. Princess Alina raised her hand, and the envoy fell silent. Her voice was calm, but edged with something none of them had heard before. She asked Ethan where he had learned the song. His throat tightened, but he told her the truth. He had studied scraps of old writings found in forgotten records, and he had pieced them together with patience. He did not claim mastery, only that he had sung from his heart, hoping to honor her people. She studied him in silence. The hall grew restless, waiting for her judgment. Then, in a voice that trembled just enough to betray her, she told him to continue. Ethan felt his chest grow tight. He had not expected her to ask that. His hands shook, but he obeyed. Once more he sang, letting the fragments fall into melody. This time he sang with more courage, his voice rising, filling every corner of the hall. As he sang, the crowd grew quiet again. Yet the old words were broken, yet they carried more weight than polished speeches. Guards forgot their posture. Counselors lowered their heads. The song became a mirror, showing everyone not just what was, but what had been lost. Princess Alina closed her eyes, and though she tried to remain still, tears slipped down her cheeks. No one dared speak while she wept. Ethan finished with a soft note that faded like a breath in the wind. Silence followed. No applause, no shouts, only silence. Then the princess stood. She did not look at the envoys from Earth, nor at her counselors. Her eyes were fixed only on Ethan. She told him that his voice had carried the soul of her people, and that he had reminded them of something more important than treaties. Her words trembled, but her tone carried the weight of truth. The hall erupted in voices after she spoke. Some lords argued that it was dangerous to let a stranger hold such power. Others whispered that perhaps Earth and the kingdom were not so far apart after all. The Earth envoys looked furious, as if they had lost control of the moment. Ethan, however, felt only the weight of her gaze and the strange warmth in her eyes that had not been there before. When the gathering ended, the envoys left in anger, muttering about order and discipline. But Ethan remained behind, summoned by the princess herself. He followed her through long halls lined with painted glass and golden light. His heart pounded. He did not know if she would punish him or thank him, but he knew this path had already changed everything. Whatever came next, the song had opened a door, and neither of them could close it again. The long corridor felt endless as Ethan followed Princess Alina. Her steps were steady, but her silence weighed heavier than any words could. Tall windows spilled golden light onto the stone floor, painting shapes that seemed to move as they passed. Ethan's heart thudded in his chest, unsure if he was walking toward reward or punishment. Finally, they entered a smaller chamber lined with books and tapestries. It was quiet, away from the echo of the great hall. Alina turned to him, her face calm, but her eyes still red from tears she could not fully hide. For a moment, she said nothing. She simply looked at him as if trying to decide what kind of man stood before her. Ethan lowered his head, ready to face anger. But instead, she asked him softly where he had learned the words. He explained again that he had studied old records, broken fragments kept in forgotten archives. He told her how he had pieced them together, night after night, until the language became music in his mind. He admitted that he did not know if his words were correct, only that they came from his heart. She listened, and her composure cracked. She told him that when she was a child, her nurse had sung to her in that same old tongue. The songs were forbidden, considered relics of a past that no longer had place in the kingdom. But those soft voices had been her comfort, her secret treasure. When Ethan sang, she felt the years fall away, and the memory of her childhood came alive again. That was why she wept. Her voice trembled as she confessed this, and Ethan felt the room shrink around them. He saw not the princess who stood in armor before her court, but a woman who carried the weight of an entire people, and yet longed for something as simple as a song. He bowed his head again, not in duty, but in respect, and told her he was honored beyond words. Alina turned away, walking to the window. Below them stretched the city, glowing in the fading light. She said that her people had suffered many years, cut off from the world they once called home. They believed Earth had forgotten them. Her pride had kept them strong, but it had also left them alone. She whispered that when she heard his song, she felt for the first time that maybe Earth had not abandoned them. Ethan did not know what to say. He was only one man with no power, yet here stood a princess, moved by his voice. He told her simply that he wanted no reward, only to serve as a bridge between their worlds. He believed that words and music could heal where politics had failed. She turned back to him, her tears gone, but her eyes shining with new light. For a long time, they stood in silence. The air between them carried more meaning than speeches could. Then Alina said that she wished for him to sing again, not before the court, but before her alone. Her tone was not a command, but a request, as though she needed to hear the words once more to believe they were real. Ethan nodded. His throat felt tight, but he began softly, letting the notes fill the chamber. The old words rose again, smoother this time, shaped by his growing courage. Alina closed her eyes, her hands resting against the window frame. Tears slid silently down her cheeks, but she did not turn away. The song was no longer just a memory of her childhood. It became a promise of something more, a sign that bonds could be renewed. When he finished, silence wrapped around them. She whispered that the sound carried both sorrow and hope, and that she did not know which her heart felt more. Ethan answered that sometimes sorrow and hope were the same thing, two halves of one truth. She gave him a small smile then, the first he had ever seen from her. As the evening deepened, she dismissed him with gentle words. But before he left, she told him that his voice had changed the course of her people. She warned him that the path ahead would not be easy, that many would resist. But she promised that she would not forget what he had given her. Ethan walked back through the palace halls with his chest full, knowing the world had shifted, and that the tears of a princess had become the beginning of something far greater than himself. The next day, the palace stirred with tension. News of the song had spread through the city like fire. People whispered in the streets, servants spoke in hushed voices, soldiers repeated fragments of the melody as though trying to capture it for themselves. For the first time in many years, the old words of the kingdom lived again on the tongues of its people. Ethan walked through the corridors, feeling the weight of curious eyes. Some looked at him with respect, others with suspicion. He knew many lords and counselors disliked what had happened. They feared that memory would weaken their authority. But he also knew that the song had touched something deeper than politics. He could hear it in the silence that followed him, a silence waiting for more. When the council gathered again in the great hall, the air was heavy with debate. The Earth's envoys spoke of agreements and contracts, their voices sharp and full of pride. They wanted decisions, not music. They warned the princess that songs could not defend borders or fill stores with grain. Their words struck the air like stones, but they did not reach the heart. Then Princess Elena rose from her throne. Her eyes were steady, though her hands still bore the memory of tears. She spoke to her people, not in the polished language of treaties, but in the simple tongue of her ancestors. The sound caught many off guard. Her voice trembled on the old words, but the meaning was clear. She told them that they had been alone too long, that walls had given them safety, but had also left them empty. She said the song had shown her that Earth had not forgotten them. Murmurs filled the hall. Some nodded, their eyes shining with agreement. Others shook their heads, clinging to old pride. Ethan stood at the edge, silent, watching her courage unfold. When she gestured toward him, he stepped forward, uncertain but willing. She asked him to sing again, this time before all the council. His throat tightened, but he obeyed, sang with all he had, shaping each note as if it carried a piece of his soul. The hall filled with the sound, and the melody rose to the high arches above them. Guards lowered their weapons, lords forgot their arguments, and even the envoys from Earth fell into uneasy silence. The language was broken, but the feeling was whole. It was not a song of conquest or power, but of memory and belonging. When the last note faded, the hall was still. Then one of the oldest counselors stood, his face wet with tears. He declared that he had not heard those words since he was a child, carried on his mother's voice. He said that if a man from Earth could carry their forgotten tongue, then perhaps the bond between their worlds was not lost. Slowly others began to rise, one by one, not in protest but in respect. Princess Elena looked across the hall, her gaze steady. She declared that from this moment forward, they would not hide from their past. The old songs would be remembered, and their voices would join with Earth again. Her words carried strength, and though some lords still resisted, the sound of the song lingered in their ears, softening their pride. Ethan felt his chest ache with relief. He had not come as a warrior or leader, yet somehow he had carried a message no weapon could deliver. He saw in the princess's eyes the same truth, that what bound people together was not fear, but the voice of shared memory. As the gathering ended, people left in silence, but a new kind of silence, one that held promise. Ethan remained behind with Elena. She told him quietly that his song had given her courage to speak what she had long felt, but never dared to say. He answered that it was her strength, not his voice, that had moved the council. She gave him a small smile, rare and fleeting. She said the road ahead would be difficult, but she believed they had taken the first step together. Ethan bowed his head, humbled, knowing that a bridge had been built in that hall, not of stone or treaties, but of voices joined by a song that refused to die. The days after the council meeting moved slowly, but the air in the palace carried a new rhythm. Servants hummed fragments of the song while they worked. Children in the streets repeated lines they did not fully understand, their voices bright with laughter. The city had begun to remember. What was once hidden now lived again in the hearts of its people. Ethan walked the palace halls quietly, often stopping to listen to the voices around him. He had never expected to stay this long. First he thought he would sing once, then vanish back into the shadow of greater men. Yet the princess had asked him to remain, and her request carried a weight he could not refuse. He was no longer just a guest. He was part of something larger. One evening, he was summoned to a private chamber. Princess Elena stood by the window, the last light of the day painting her face in gold. She greeted him without formality, her voice softer than it had been before. She told him that the people were restless, torn between pride and longing. Some still clung to fear, while others had begun to believe in hope again. She said the song had opened a door, but now they had to decide if they would walk through it. Ethan listened, unsure if his voice alone could carry them further. He told her that songs could not build roads or ships, but they could give people the courage to try. He said that her leadership, joined with their shared memory, could guide them into a future that honored both past and present. Elena turned toward him, her eyes steady but touched with warmth. She said that was why she needed him to stay. She asked him to teach the old words to her people, to bring back the language that time had buried. She wanted him to share the songs with children, with families, with soldiers who had forgotten how to sing. Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat. He agreed, knowing it was more than he had ever dreamed. He was not a hero in the way the Earth envoys imagined, but he could give voice to something no weapon could touch. Together, they began the work. Days turned into weeks as Ethan taught simple verses in the courtyards and gardens. Crowds gathered, first curious, then eager, repeating each word until the music grew familiar on their tongues. The sound carried through the city like bells, soft but unbroken. The princess herself joined at times, her clear voice rising with the people, showing them she was not only their ruler, but one of them. The Earth envoys grew restless, watching their careful plans unravel. They had come for treaties signed with ink, not songs sung in old words, yet they could not stop what had begun. They returned to their quarters in anger, while the people filled the streets with music. Pride had softened into trust, and suspicion had given way to hope. One night, as the city glowed with lanterns, Ethan stood on the palace balcony beside the princess. Below them, thousands of voices rose together, carrying the melody he had once sung alone. The sound rolled through the streets, filling the air with something greater than any speech could have offered. Ethan felt his chest tighten, his heart full. He knew he was witnessing the birth of a new bond. Alina looked at him then, her eyes shining in the lantern light. She told him that for years she had believed Earth had abandoned her people, but his song proved otherwise. She said that even if treaties failed and envoys left, the memory of that night would remain, binding them together. She asked him if he would walk this path with her, not as a servant or guest, but as a partner in a promise renewed. Ethan met her gaze, humbled. He told her he would stay as long as she needed, not for duty, but for the simple truth that her people were now his own. She smiled, a rare and gentle smile, and together they listened to the voices below. The melody rose higher, stronger, until it seemed to touch the stars. As the night deepened, the princess whispered that the future would not be easy. There would be struggles, resistance, and pain. But she believed they had begun again, not as strangers, but as family, joined by song. Ethan nodded, his heart steady. For the first time in his life, he felt that he was exactly where he was meant to be. The city sang on, carrying hope into the night, while above them two voices, one of a man and one of a princess. It stood united in the promise of a new dawn.